Thank you. It's really a great pleasure to be here today. I have been asked to comment on epidemiology and in particular on the Interphone study, that large study that Professor Hayes already introduced you to. First, I would like to say two words about two aspects which have been discussed. One is that we should do cohort study. This means enrolling people who are exposed now and following them up into the future to see who is going to get disease or not. The only, quote-unquote, problem with that is that we will have to wait 20 more years before getting the answer. And I think that just may be a little long. That's one point. I mean, they could be started. At least if we had started years earlier, we already have some of the answer. And the other comment is about when is it time to act? I dare to say, well, maybe scientists can also say something to politicians and to the decision maker. And I will use the parallel most often presented in epidemiology. It goes back to the 17th century and to the study of a cholera epidemic in London. A guy who was named John Snow was asked to look at the map of cholera cases in London. And he designed that map, not by computer at the time, but nevertheless, he did a good map. And he was astonished that most of the cholera cases were focused, clustered in some parts of London. And he thought, what could be different about this part of London? And he figured out that the main difference was where the water came from, taken from the Thames River and going to pumps to get the water to the people of London. At that time, he had no idea what the organism which is responsible for the cholera, the Vibrio cholera, came from. But nevertheless, he thought it would be a good idea maybe to close up these pumps in some of that parts of London. By doing this, he had an impact on the cholera epidemic. Using nowadays words, we could say that he acted based on the precautionary principle. He did not have the proof, yet he thought something could be done. And I think nowadays, maybe we need to do the same thing about some hazards which are in our environment. If we wait for a final proof, we will all be dead, and may that come late. Okay, now I will get back really to my topic, which is the Interphone study. What is that study? It's the largest ever conducted epidemiological study on cell phones and other selected tumors. So the concept of a study was proposed by a woman, Elizabeth Cardis, who was working at IARC, at the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is the specialized cancer agency of the World Health Organization in the mid-90s, and we were in two neighboring offices. The original hypothesis she had at the time, and she defended in order to get her funding, that maybe cell phones were having a promoting effect rather than an initiating effect on tumor development. What does that mean? It simply means that cell phone make it easier to develop. If you have a tiny tumor, it will show up faster, even if it were not at the origin of a tumor. And why did she defend the thesis? Because then it was providing her with a rationale for already at that time starting a study, whereas the time during which cell phone had been used on any large scale was very limited, too limited, in fact, for showing already a cancer effect. So she did the things very well, and she conducted very extensive pilot studies, feasibility phase. She tested everything, all aspects of a protocol, the questionnaire, which was a very long questionnaire, which was going to be used in different countries, in different circumstances. So this was a very well planned and started study. And then she showed also at that time that there was a need for a very large study if one wanted to see any impact. So the study design she selected is the one usually called case control study. Prefer to call it case reference study, but it's the same thing. It means a study of people who have now the tumor, for example, the brain tumor we want to study, and compare these people with others who do not have any cancer, and then ask all of these people, the cases and the reference, what did they do in the preceding years with regard of the use of cell phone, as well as collecting other information on other risk factors, for example, for brain cancer. So the study was coordinated by the International Agency for Research on Cancer and conducted in 13 studies. Dr. Hayes already said it: Australia, Canada, Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, Israel, Italy, Japan, New Zealand, Norway, Sweden, UK. And as you can notice, the only North American country included was Canada. It was not done in the US. In all of these countries, the same protocol, basic protocol, was used, but then countries were left free to add other questions or other investigations. For study funding, you need lots of money to do a study in 13 countries. So overall, the total cost of Interphone is over $20 million US, with at least 6 coming from the industry. So therefore, it was funded by a mixture of public funded, mostly from the European program, the European Fifth Framework Program of the European Union, as well as private funding coming from the Mobiles Manufacturers Forum and the GSM Association, to try to have some independence between the researchers and the funding partners. The funds coming from the industry were getting into IARC through step, which was provided by the International Union Against Cancer, the UICC. So therefore, by the authors of this Interphone study, it is stated that there is limited conflict of interest and there was full independence. But I think it would have been nicer if a study had been 100% public funds funded. So that study already has been somewhat described. There were more than 6,000 cases and close to 800,000 population reference, including at least 2,600 gliomas, 2,300 meningiomas, 1,100 acoustic neurinomas. That's the tumors on the acoustic nerve, which allows you to hear, and 400 parotid gland tumors. That's what Deborah already presented. The study subjects were recruited between 1999 and 2004, meaning at a time when use of cell phone was still limited and past use of cell phone was even much more limited. Selected population groups, businessmen, for example, were using it, but hardly any population in the general population. And the ones who were using cell phones were using it for very short period of times compared to nowadays use. The information was collected through lengthy questionnaires, either asked to the people themselves, or in the case, for example, the cancer cases that already died, to family people, the wife or some kids of the ones who died. So the publication of a study result was done, and they're still not finished, far from being finished, in 2 phases. The first one being that there were some publications at national levels, at least in 9 of the countries out of 13, and also in some combination of the countries, for example, the Nordic countries in Europe taken as a group. And the first publication appeared in 2004. But for getting the publication of the pooled data for these 13 countries, it took 6 more years, and the first publication only appeared in May 2010, 5 years after the analysis had been conducted at IRC. So it took the investigators a long time to agree on one first paper. That international publication, for the time being, is limited to brain tumors. So others should come on acoustic neurinomas, on parotid glands, etc. And you have a reference here for ones who are interested. Here, I'm sure you will not be able to read it because it's too small, but it's just a cut and paste from the original publication, so from that Interphone publication. So as I didn't want to be accused of rewriting what they did, it's really a cut and paste from the original publication. But I did put a few things in red because they were, in a way, unusual in what you find in the results paragraph of a summary of a scientific result. Scientific publication. Usually you will only find numbers in the result part, whereas in this document you find already there comments about potential biases, the thing that saying reflection, participation bias, they are implausible values, the confidence intervals are very large. So these type of comments are perfectly fine in publications, but usually you find them in the discussion part, not in the results themselves. Then they provided some values, and I will comment on this in everyday English terms, English with a French accent, but nevertheless. And then the conclusion from the publication, which also is a cut and paste from the original population, is here and has already been stated. Overall, no increase in risk of glioma or meningiomas was observed with use of mobile phones. There were suggestions of an increased risk of glioma at the highest exposure levels. In fact, it should be level because it's only one. It's the 10th percentile. But biases and error prevent a causal interpretation. The possible effects of long-term heavy use of mobile phones require further investigation. So what does it mean? It means that, technically speaking, in epidemiological ways, the studies, in fact, not only doesn't show an increased risk, but shows an overall protective effect, because the measure of association, called the odds ratio, an estimate of relative risk, I mean, telling you by how much the risk is going to be increased if you are exposed to a cell phone versus not exposed, is smaller than 1. 1 means no association. Anything greater than 1 means there is a risk, but anything lower than 1 means there is a protection. So do we really expect that cell phone could protect? It's what we see. And when you find this protection, then you start wondering, why could there be a protection? And the main reason we can think of, at least some of us think of, for that Interphone study, is that the referent population, the ones called controls, were in fact less likely to be phone users. And this has been demonstrated in one study which was published by some of the Interphone investigators. What does that mean? It means that when you're a case, you're sick in a hospital, then you have, quote unquote, time to answer questions of someone wearing a white coat. Whereas when you are in the general population and someone asks you to fill a questionnaire which will last more than 1 hour to fill, you don't really have a motivation. And when people figure out that most of his questions, very detailed questions, were on the use of cell phones, in fact, people using cell phones were much more likely to answer the questions, whereas the non-users declined to participate. So there, immediately, the population used as a control was biased and made it much more difficult to identify a risk. I know that what I'm saying may be difficult to understand because it's pure epidemiological jargon, but the concept is clear. If you compare people who use cell phones with people who use cell phones, then of course you don't find much of a difference, and there you even found a protection. But if we look closely at this study result, in fact, that study, which is most of the time branded as purely negative study, no association, there was an increased risk. Of course, only in one subgroup, the people who were the heaviest phone users, and they were defined as more than 1,640 hours, which is not a huge amount over a 10-year period. It's even a small amount. And this increase was clearer for the gliomas, which are the tumors of the brain itself, not the meningioma. Meningioma, it's the tumors of the envelope of the brain. There, and on which side? On the side of the brain where the phone is usually held. And when people say, well, it's just because the cases will say that, of course, they had the phone, they held the phone on the side where they do develop the tumor. I don't really buy this kind of explanation, because for using a phone, just like for writing or for jumping, you tend to have one preferential side. Whether you're right-handed or left-handed, you are usually holding the phone on one side of your brain. I know that myself, unless now I think about it, I try to change the side, I always hold it on the right side, right? Because that's my habit. So in fact, the fact that we see an increased risk most clearly on the side of the brain where you have been holding the phone, again, goes in favor of an association. And it means, as I said several times, that where we found the risk, or the interphone investigator found the risk, that's where it would have been expected just by pure logic. And then if we want to get more, but I will not get into it, into more technical details, there were published online at least further analysis based on different assumptions, different reference group, if they limited it just to the ones who had ever used a cell phone. And when the investigator did that kind of sensitivity analysis, it goes up to about 2 for the people who were the heaviest users. So what do I conclude with some of the people based on this analysis? That it's better to be safe than to be sorry. So I think it's much better to be cautious without waiting for the full evidence, because it may take a while. And the additional difficulty is that nowadays, where are you going to find people who are not exposed? Almost everyone is using cell phones in the world. Then you can find people living in monasteries, and usually they don't use that much of cell phone. Even there you can find cell phones, and I went to some monasteries, so even there you can find cell phones, but much less than in the general population. But of course, you cannot compare people living in the monastery to the general population. So the difficulty for studies to start now, I think it's almost impossible to find non-exposed population. Then, of course, we can do study by degrees of exposure. So compare the small users of cell phones to the very big users, and most probably we will find a difference, but it will not be easy to see it. The other comment is that what was called a heavy users in the interphone or in old studies are very light users by today's terms and habits in the general population. And that, of course, the interphone doesn't say anything about people having been exposed starting at a very young age. And as we saw from the pictures that Beverly Davis showed, you know that when kids are using cell phones, the proportion of their brain being exposed is much bigger, and therefore we should be even much more cautious with young kids than we are with adult population. So there I will end up with a drawing which comes from Le Monde. It's a very well-known French newspaper. And just to show that already in 2007, so some years ago, that was published by the end of December of 2007, there was some public discussion about cell phone and other sources of radio wave exposures. And I think really that even if we do not have today all the answers, and I know that my hierarchy usually doesn't like when I say that, I know we don't have a full evidence. Maybe we know enough, at least to be cautious. Thank you.